Hello and welcome to the AFL High Performance Podcast. My name is Jack McLean. Today is a solo monthly update for our strength and conditioning coaches, high performance coaches, specifically around plyometric training, how to periodize it, the surface, your exercise prescription, your dosage, to ultimately develop your own framework that you can go away and help build some clarity around what can be quite a complex exercise prescription, how to put a plan, a session plan together that ultimately gets the results or the outcome that you're looking for different populations, whether it be reconditioning, rehab athletes, main group management, differing from older athletes, to help prevent dying a slow death, as Dean Menton, I remember, mentioning to me one day on one of our catch-up sessions. Ultimately, if you don't program plyometrics, or if athletes don't move explosively later on in their career, then you're setting them up to die a slow death, which I think rings home, as well as developing athletes. How can we ensure that we're building competency and developing along a clear framework that allows them to perform well on game day and reduce the risk of injury. What is a plyometric? It's a rapid explosive movements with short ground contact time, typically under 0.25 milliseconds on the ground, emphasizing the stretch shortening cycle. So things like what wouldn't be a plyometric under this, our definition would be like a squat jump, due to you're not reacting with the ground explosively. You're spending time, you might be 300 milliseconds, but also your feet start on the ground and then they come off the ground after the jump. Whereas a drop jump, where you're starting on a box and you step off the box and then explosively jump as high as you can off the ground, that would be a plyometric. And typically we want to cue the athletes first to be around that 0.25. I've found in my experience, athletes from a technical point of view will be very toey with plyometrics, even with vertical ones. We want them to be in the ball of the foot. So if it's a vertical projection with a short ground contact time, we want pre-tension in the ankle. So therefore heels close to the ground, lifting the big toes up. So you're getting the full face of the hammer, the full foot hitting the ground. And we've got that pre-tension in the angle. So the Achilles is pre-tense, just like a rubber band. Explain to the athlete, we want to stretch that band, so then when it hits the ground, it recoils and it drives you vertically. When we're going horizontally, so if we're doing things like bounds, that's where you naturally will be leaning a little bit more weight forward throughout your posture, and naturally there's a bit more weight on the front of the foot, the ball of the foot, and the heel might have a credit card distance off the ground, perhaps, with our forward bounds, forward hops. If we're going for airtime, that's where you're going more vertical, and that's perhaps where you want that flat foot contact. So there varies, things like lateral movements, typically preparing them for things like power cuts and the penultimate step, which those fields, positions on the field are always through a full foot. So therefore we want to make those positions, those joint angles, to be able to allow that lateral, where you're pushing through the medial part of the foot, lateral part of the foot, like triple hops, to be a flat foot activity. So yeah, coaching, particularly in your volume phase, where we're building up their resilience and their tissues to this type of training, that's where you want to coach these positions with the foot and the pre-tension and preparing good habits. Then when we're going through that intensification phase, you should have they should have a good understanding of how to pre-tense the position of their core, their trunk. They've got good lumbic pelvic control, coordination with the swing leg, and ultimately their tissues are ready for those high force activities. That's where you can build those fundamentals in the early stage, getting more your extensive work, double leg work, and then when you're doing more high force activities like bounds, off a box, drop jumps, depth jumps, so they're higher force activities, more advanced, your athlete, and typically you expose them to unilateral single leg tasks as well. They're going to have a much higher strain and higher stress, which is great for adaptation, but we want to make sure we build them up to that. Starting with surface types. So I think this is for me anyway, it's an area over the last couple of years working in reconditioning. typically have a period of time when athletes injured where they perhaps can't do any running, and we want to prep them for running, prep them for high intensity actions like accelerations, agility, and sprinting. So while they aren't doing the work on the field, you can microdose some plyometric work and use the surface area. So rather than going through like a deceleration phase, like landing off a box, for example, and then going through a concentric phase where you might do some jumps, and then going through like an extensive phase where you're doing some just like rudiment hops, and then ultimately progressing to more intensification phase. So it's quite linear in its progression. We're going to ultimately lose that deceleration work that we did in week 1, and that might have been a month ago. So what we want to try and do is have that vertical integration model where you're doing deceleration work, you're doing concentric power work, you're doing reactivity work, extensively and intensively, all in the same week. So where we can periodize it is the surface. So for an athlete that they're, due to their injury, they're not ready for the grass, you might be doing their intensification stuff in the pool at rib height, around 50% body weight. They might be doing their extensive work, double leg activity, slow, spending a bit more time on the ground, maybe 0.3, 0.4, or it might be a bit quicker than that. And they're on the blue mat, for example, or like an air mat. And then they could be doing their concentric power on a box jump. So you're taking out the landing forces with that. So use the surface, to periodize your exercise prescription. And then ultimately they progress from the pool for their single leg intensive work onto a band assisted, for example, where you set up some bands into the rig, under the armpits, pull the band down to eye level. So there's heaps of assistance there, and you're doing some single leg hops for height with short ground contact times. Then that ultimately can progress. Their double leg stuff would be on the grass. And maybe you're doing it by that stage, some just rhythm dribbles and some running based position work, like ankle based, shin based dribbling with some rhythm A skips, for example. And then ultimately you're progressing that single leg drop jump work on off a box. And you've used the surface once the athlete's ready, and then that's preparing them for more high intensity actions that they're going to do on the field in later stages of rehab, like cutting, decelerating, sprinting, and hard accelerations. So keep all those stimuluses in the program at all times where possible, and use the surface to help allow the athlete from a central nervous system to generate those explosive movements, still work on the coordination, still keep all the pre-tension in the ankle, all those things alive, training the tendons, and then you're ultimately just using different surface areas to mitigate things against the bone, tendon, or muscle, depending on what you're training. Brings on the question of all the different surface types you might use. So typically what I've used in the past would be the pool, which will be the easiest. Then you've got like an air mat for things like intro drilling work. We've also got the sprung floor to help with their elastic work. In the typically gymnastics center will have that. You'll have Ultra G, where you can run it on a treadmill at different percentages of body weight for your early stages of running. If for a low imagery, if they haven't run for a while, so they might run at like 70-75% Ultra G session 1, and then like an 80 build up to 90% Ultra G session 2, and then they run on ground, for example. Then you've obviously got your gym surface, which has a bit more spring to it at times, depending on where you're at. And then you've got your AstroTurf, and then which can be quite hard, and then obviously grass, and then you've got your concrete for things like hill sprints, which would be the hardest that athletes are exposed to, plus the track and field as well, the AEST track, where you can get a lot more spring and high ground reaction forces. So great for your intensive plyometrics, where you want to stimulate the bone or stimulate the tendons under high forces. So think about the opposite. And then, early on in the stage, probably in between pool and the air mat, you could use the sand as well to work on some lower, reduce the ground reaction forces. You can also use all those surfaces for proprioceptive type work as well, single leg, barefoot training, where we're working on all those foot intrinsics. And obviously the sand, you've got a grip with your toes a bit more. So that's going to strengthen their big toe and the arch a lot more. Things like the air mat, the blue mat, there's a lot more instability. So you're going to challenge the co-contractions of the foot, and there's naturally going to just be a lot more variation with it. So you can use these different surface areas, surface types, sorry, to challenge your proprioceptors and keep that, keep the body and the athlete adapting in that space as well. Biggest mistakes when it comes to plyometric training, we want to make sure when we're prescribing the exercise, we're considering things like the stance. So what's some common stance that the athlete that you see that they are on the field, and we want to mimic that as best as possible. So obviously the running based sports, you spend a lot of time single leg stance. So clearly unilateral ply is going to be important. There's staggered stance for athletes. So like in an acceleration position, like for rugby athletes in a scrum, for example, or there's double leg stance, for athletes when they're side shuffling, like a basketball court. We've got your contact time that we want to take into account. Is it typically slow, stretch, shorten cycle work? Is it fast, real explosive, rapid contraction time? As well as the different contacts with the ground as well. Is it more vertical, horizontal, and lateral? What's our focus from a vector point of view? Are we putting force into the ground vertically and launching our body up as vertically as high as possible towards the sky? Is it more horizontal? We know with vertical, it's going to have a bit more correlation with sprinting. Horizontal is going to be more acceleration, and then the lateral work is going to be for things like deceleration, cutting, and all our agility-based movements. So considering that, how the athlete moves and what we need to do from a reconditioning point of view, as well as athletic development. So considering those key things, consider also, like I said, the a harder surface will be better than a softer surface because you're going deliberately for that bone stim, for example. So it's not like the softer surfaces are always better than the harder. If we're going for more high force and we really want to load up and build up our tendon strength, our reactive strength, then typically the AEST track, the sprung floor is going to help with that. Or only going vertical and prescribing only jumping, not reactive work. So we will need to be multi-directional for field sports, team sports, as that's the sport. So thinking of obviously our lateral work, like I mentioned, and the horizontal work, like bounding forwards, hops forwards. I like the north, south, east, west, where you do double leg hops and you go one forward, one backwards, one side, and progressing over 15 meters, 10 to 15 meters. That's a good way to get everything. If you want to cue more contact time, then it's hot coals. If you want them to get better in the air and generating high forces, then get them to launch up a little bit higher and spend a bit more time on the ground. You want to consider the stimulus that you're looking for. So use testing as a get a sense of, does the athlete use a lot of range of motion, spend a lot of time on the ground? Are they more ground-based, or are they more air-based, more springy? So whether you want to strengthen their strengths and you're going through that phase, a sharpening phase, maybe going into finals campaign, or perhaps you're working on more development, long-term picture, and you want to strengthen their weaknesses, you would prescribe cues and drills to expose them to that. So if their contact time is poor, the skipping rope is great because that's a great constraint to ensure that you're going to be snapping off the ground. If you're wanting them to jump a little bit higher, that's where using boxes and using depth jumps where they've got to launch themselves onto a box can help with that. So set the environment, set the constraints, and think about what adaptation you're seeking, and that work back from that. Work back from the game, work back from the adaptation that the athlete needs. Probably another common mistake would be not going through like a classic periodization approach over the off-season, pre-season, season, building up the volume, building up the tolerance like we would with anything, running loads, gym loads. We always go through that volume phase where we're coaching technique, getting good fundamental habits, ingraining the patterns, then bringing in the intensity once we've earned the right, once the athlete's built that robustness. If you go straight into the intensity phase, in my experience, that's where you just get yourself like niggles or tendinopathies, or the athlete just won't be as competent at the movement patterns. So you build those, ingrain those good habits early, and then they'll set them up to succeed later. Also, you don't want to use all your ACE cards at once. So if you're using all the intensification bounds and drop jumps and depth jumps early on, you could have made just as much progress with the more extensive fundamental stuff early. And then you've got those more high stress ACE cards up your sleeve for later on when they're hitting plateau. Really important that we test. So for me, the most common ones would be the drop jump double leg on a 45 centimeter box, single leg drop jump on a 30 centimeter box. The 10-5 is popular. I've always, if I had a force plate embedded in the ground, I would use it. But whenever playing it around with myself or with an athlete, they're constrained by feeling like they're going to roll their ankle or slip off the force plate. But when it's elevated off the ground, I've never really used the 10-5 heaps. Side hop, not on force plates, but just get in to jump over a 30 centimeter piece of 2 pieces of tape. 40 centimeters, 30 seconds, as many reps as possible, aiming for above 50. The research was with soccer players, I believe, and obviously taking into account their body mass. So, if it was on soccer athletes that averaged 75 kilos, if you've got a 100-kilo athlete, you probably take 10% off that standard of 50 each side. And then you can also go with symmetry as well. Have a look at their left or right, knowing that no doubt there's going to be an asymmetry there, but is it a huge gap on the video test, just using your coach's eye? What's their competency like? Are they all over the place and lose control? Are they spending lots of time on the ground? Is it not continuous? But yeah, the side hop's quite good for before you're progressing their agility, change direction type work. And then the triple hop from ACL perspective, where we're jumping 3 times out horizontally, but in a zigzag fashion. If you're going for pure raw power, don't get them to stick at the end. And you can just work on that speed aspect of it and just see how much power they can generate. Other things to consider is the body mass and body size of the athlete. So for our wider based athletes, heavy set athletes, be mindful of how much you're doing hard surfaces and off a box. Look at their competency. If they're spending too much time on the ground, you're not going to get the adaptation you seek anyway. So that's where you might reduce the box height. You might soften the surface type to help their spring, or you just program exercises that are at that competency of that level. So, things like just simple rudiment hops, for example, rather than going to exercises that the rest of the group might be doing that's too advanced for that athlete. So individualize it. Same with the athletes that are super explosive. You got to understand it's different to the barbell, where you know the load by the weight that's on the bar. With this, we don't know we can't quantify unless you're using force plates for every rep, how much force they're putting in the ground. So for your more explosive power, speed-based athletes that are really reactive, you probably want to take a set or 2 off compared to the main group when they're doing it, understanding they're generating a lot more force. Or you program for distance, and that way they're going to have less ground contacts with the ground compared to someone who's less explosive. They're both going for 10 meters. Some might do it with 3, others might need 5 steps, for example, in the hops. Biggest influences to wrap it up. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Specifically for coaches. Hopefully there's a framework there so you can build out a level system. Level 1 being your extensive double leg work, all the way through to level 2, level 3, level 5, where you're doing more intense plyometrics on harder surfaces. So you can build that framework, and then that way you can always program, like I said, all the different vectors: vertical, horizontal, agility, and lateral. You're always programming the different stimuluses that we're going for: high force, more speed, contact based, intensive, extensive work. And the biggest influences I've had to date would be Matt Watson, the Plyo guy on Instagram. Got lots of practical tips there. Boosh next night, I love his fancy or fast. You can't be both. So critiquing, in the industry, we're quite big on using instability and lots of different variations to challenge the coordination system, which is important. But if our ultimate goal is to improve their plyometric ability or their speed, then we want to keep it simple. Keep it an exercise the athlete can generate maximal force into the ground rapidly, quick. So you can go fancy or fast. I love that quote from Boo. Yuri Verkhoshansky, the shock method, obviously from a reactivity development point of view. He's one of the OGs when it comes to fundamentals and doing research and making this work famous. We have, and then Eamon Flanagan from a research perspective, as well as helping build out your own tier framework. Go check out his work. There's plenty of podcasts out there and research articles. Thanks for tuning in to this episode. I will see you on our next live update or interview. Thanks, guys.